Hey there, wonderful viewers. If you're enjoying my content, please take a second to hit that like button. It really helps the YouTube algorithm show my videos to more people. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Now grab your favorite drink, sit back, relax, and let's dive into today's story. I promise it'll be worth your time. It was early June 2023 when I first encountered true terror. Summer had barely begun to stretch its warm fingers across the landscape, and I was 16, naive and eager for adventure. My best friend since elementary school, Theo, had convinced me to spend a week at Pine Ridge Summer Camp, a place nestled deep in the Adirondack Mountains. "It'll be awesome, trust me," he'd insisted, waving the brochure in my face. "We'll swim, hike, maybe meet some girls." The typical teenage motivations that seemed so important back then. My parents dropped us off that Sunday morning, the gravel crunching beneath our car tires as we pulled into the sprawling campground. Pine Ridge looked exactly like those summer camps you see in movies. Wooden cabins arranged in neat clusters, a large central lodge with a stone chimney, trails leading off into dense forest, and a glittering lake visible through the trees. Parents milled about, helping unload duffel bags and sleeping bags, hugging reluctant teenagers goodbye. "You sure you want to do this?" my mom asked as she handed me my backpack. "A whole week is a long time." "I'll be fine," I assured her, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Truth be told, I'd never been away from home for more than 2 nights. But I wasn't about to admit that in front of Theo, who was already chatting with some other campers nearby. The camp director, a broad-shouldered woman named Ms. Winters, gathered everyone around the flagpole for orientation. She had the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades outdoors and spoke with an authoritative tone that immediately commanded respect. "Welcome to Pine Ridge," she announced. "Parents, please make sure you've signed all the consent and medical forms before you leave. Campers, once you're registered, you'll be assigned to cabins with your respective counselors." Registration was a tedious process of forms and name tags, but eventually Theo and I were assigned to Cabin 7, along with 8 other boys around our age. Our counselor's name was Vincent, and this is where my memory first prickles with unease. Vincent wasn't what I expected in a camp counselor. While the others were energetic, outdoorsy types in their early 20s, Vincent was different. He was tall and unnervingly thin, with pale skin that suggested he avoided sunlight whenever possible. His hair was black, long, and perpetually looked unwashed, hanging limply around a gaunt face dominated by deep-set eyes. When he smiled, which was rare, it never reached those eyes. "Welcome to Cabin 7, he said, his voice oddly soft as we entered the rustic wooden structure that would be our home for the next week. "Choose any bunk except the one by the door. That's mine." Theo immediately claimed a top bunk near the back window, and I took the one below him. The other boys, whose names I would soon learn were Ryan, Jake, Will, Cody, Ben, Gabe, Jason, and Troy, scattered to their chosen beds. Vincent watched us silently from the doorway, his thin arms crossed over his chest. There was something about the way he observed us, clinical, detached, that made my skin crawl. But I dismissed my discomfort as first-day nerves and the natural awkwardness of being in a new place. That night, after we'd unpacked and had dinner in the main lodge, Vincent gathered us around a small fire pit behind our cabin. "Camp tradition," he explained, his face ghostly in the firelight. "First night we share something about ourselves that no one else knows. Something secret." The other boys shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances. Vincent smiled that empty smile and added, "I'll start. Before I worked here, I spent 6 months in a psychiatric facility for observation." The silence that followed was deafening. I remember looking at Theo, whose eyes had widened to the size of quarters. Was this some sort of joke? But Vincent's expression remained completely serious. "They said I had unusual thought patterns," he continued, staring into the flames. "But they couldn't diagnose me with anything specific, so they let me go." His eyes lifted, scanning our faces one by one. "Your turn." I don't remember what secrets were shared that night. My mind was too preoccupied with Vincent's revelation and the growing certainty that something wasn't right about him. What kind of camp hired someone with a psychiatric history to supervise minors? Why would he share something so personal on our first night? As I lay in my bunk later, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the forest and the rhythmic breathing of 9 other people, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd made a terrible mistake coming here. Outside, an owl hooted mournfully, and somewhere in the distance something crashed through the underbrush. But neither of those sounds disturbed me as much as the soft, almost imperceptible footsteps of Vincent, pacing back and forth by the cabin door until long after midnight. Monday morning arrived with golden sunlight streaming through the cabin windows, and the distant sound of a bugle signaling breakfast. For a moment I forgot about Vincent's strange behavior the previous night, caught up in the excitement of my first full day at camp. Theo was already up, pulling on a t-shirt and shorts. "Dude, get up," he said, throwing a pillow at my head. "I heard they're doing pancakes today." The main lodge was buzzing with activity, campers lining up for food, counselors directing traffic and answering questions, kitchen staff hustling behind the serving counter. I spotted Vincent sitting alone at the far end of a table, methodically cutting his pancakes into identical squares before eating each one individually. He didn't look up when we entered. After breakfast, Ms. Winters announced the day's activities: canoeing, archery, rock climbing, and swimming. We would rotate through them in our cabin groups. "I'm signing up for swimming first," Theo declared, heading toward the activity board. I followed, scanning the crowd for familiar faces from our cabin. That's when I first noticed her, a girl with auburn hair pulled back in a ponytail, laughing with a group of friends. As if sensing my gaze, she looked up, and for a brief moment our eyes met before I awkwardly looked away. "Her name's Ivy," a voice said quietly beside me, causing me to jump. Vincent had appeared at my elbow without making a sound. "She's in cabin 3, second year here." His eyes remained fixed on her for several uncomfortable seconds before he turned to me. "You should focus on activities, not girls. There's not enough time for both." His tone was neutral, but something in his expression, a tightness around his mouth perhaps, suggested disapproval. Before I could respond, he moved away to gather the rest of our cabin. Our first activity was canoeing. The lake was calm that morning, its surface a mirror reflecting the surrounding pines and the cloudless blue sky. Vincent paired us up and assigned canoes, but opted to stay on shore himself. "I'll watch from here," he said, settling onto a rock with a clipboard. "Someone needs to make sure none of you drown." Theo and I paddled out to the middle of the lake, far enough that Vincent became a small, dark figure on the shoreline. "So what's the deal with our counselor?" Theo asked, dipping his paddle lazily in the water. "That story last night about the psych ward. Pretty weird, right?" "Definitely weird," I agreed, glancing back toward shore. Even from a distance, I could feel Vincent's eyes on us. He gives off strange vibes. "Maybe he's just socially awkward," Theo suggested with a shrug. "Some of these outdoor types aren't great with people." I wanted to believe that explanation, but something told me there was more to Vincent than simple awkwardness. The way he moved so silently, how he watched people when he thought no one was looking, the calculated precision of his actions, it all seemed deliberate, rehearsed, as if he were playing a role he hadn't quite mastered. The rest of the morning passed without incident. Vincent remained distant but functional, giving instructions and keeping time. At lunch, I managed to position myself at a table where I could see Ivy, gathering my courage to talk to her. But as soon as I stood up with my tray, Vincent materialized beside me. "Time for archery," he said flatly. "Let's go." At the archery range, Vincent transformed. What had been detachment became intense focus as he demonstrated proper technique. His hands moved with surprising grace as he nocked an arrow, drew back the bowstring, and released. The arrow hit the center of the target with a solid thunk. "The key is to become one with the arrow," he told us, his voice taking on an animated quality I hadn't heard before. "Visualize its path, feel the tension in the string as an extension of your own muscles." He moved among us, correcting our stances and grips. When he reached me, his cold fingers adjusted my elbow, lingering a moment too long. "You need to relax," he murmured, standing close enough that I could smell something medicinal on his breath. "Your fear is visible in your posture." I wanted to ask what he meant by that. I wasn't afraid of archery, but something in his expression stopped me. His eyes held a knowing look, as if he could see straight through me to some truth I wasn't aware of myself. Later that afternoon, During free time, Theo and I explored the camp boundaries, discovering a small clearing with fallen logs arranged in a rough circle. "Perfect hideout," Theo declared, flopping down on one of the logs. "We should come back here at night, maybe bring some of the others." I was about to agree when I noticed something carved into the log beside me. A series of crude stick figures with exaggerated limbs. They appeared to be running from a larger, more angular figure. The carving was fresh, the exposed wood still light against the weathered surface. "Hey, check this out," I called to Theo, running my finger over the etching. "Probably some kids from last year," he said without much interest. "Or maybe one of the younger cabins this year." But something about the carving disturbed me. The fleeing figures conveyed such panic, such desperation in their simple lines. And the pursuing figure, there was something familiar about its elongated form. As we headed back toward camp for dinner, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Twice I turned suddenly, thinking I'd catch someone following us, but the trail behind us remained empty. Yet the sensation persisted. Eyes tracking our movements through the dense undergrowth, monitoring, assessing. "Did you hear that?" I asked Theo after a particularly loud rustle in the bushes. "Probably just a squirrel," he said, though he quickened his pace slightly. "This place has you jumpy." Perhaps he was right. Perhaps the isolation of the camp, combined with Vincent's oddness, was making me paranoid. But as we emerged from the tree line into the clearing where the cabins stood, I glanced back one last time and saw a shadow move between the trunks, too tall and too deliberate to be any kind of animal. That night, I lay awake long after the others had fallen asleep, listening to the sounds of the cabin. 9 different breathing patterns, some deep and regular, others punctuated by soft snores or mumbling, but I counted only 9. The 10th, Vincent's, was missing. His bunk by the door lay empty, the covers neatly arranged as if they hadn't been disturbed. I don't know what prompted me to look toward the window, but when I did, I nearly cried out. Vincent stood outside, his tall figure silhouetted against the moonlight, staring directly at our cabin. He remained motionless for what seemed like hours, a sentinel watching over or perhaps watching his sleeping charges. Eventually, exhaustion overcame my unease, and I drifted into uneasy dreams filled with stick figures running through endless forests, pursued by a shadow that never tired. Tuesday brought clouds and a chill that hadn't been present the day before. The mountains surrounding Pine Ridge seemed closer somehow, more imposing under the gray sky. A light mist hung over the lake, giving the entire camp an isolated, otherworldly feeling. Vincent was already up when we awoke, sitting on his bunk fully dressed, writing in a small black notebook. He snapped it shut as soon as the first boy stirred. "Morning hike today," he announced without preamble. "Dress warmly." At breakfast, I noticed dark circles under his eyes as if he hadn't slept at all. His movements were slightly more jerky than usual, his gaze more intense as it swept across the dining hall. When he caught me watching him, his lips twitched in what might have been an attempt at a smile. "Sleep well?" he asked, though something in his tone suggested he already knew the answer. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Had he seen me watching him through the window last night? Had he been there specifically so I would see him? The questions churned in my stomach, spoiling my appetite for the eggs and bacon on my plate. The morning hike took us along a narrow trail that wound up into the hills behind the camp. Vincent set a brisk pace at the front of our group, occasionally stopping to point out a plant or rock formation in a monotone voice that suggested he was reciting from a script rather than sharing genuine interest. "Red trillium," he said, crouching beside a 3-petaled flower, also known as wake robin or stinking Benjamin. Native Americans used it as a birthing aid. He looked up at us, his expression blank. "It's also highly toxic if ingested improperly. Just 1 gram of the rhizome can cause vomiting, diarrhea, and potentially death." The casual way he mentioned death sent a shiver through me. Throughout the hike, Vincent seemed to focus exclusively on the dangerous or poisonous aspects of nature. Which mushrooms could stop your heart? Which plants could cause painful blisters? Which innocent-looking berries could paralyze your respiratory system? "Dude's like a walking death encyclopedia," Ryan whispered to me as Vincent lectured about the various ways the eastern timber rattlesnake could kill a person. "It's weird," I agreed, "like he's trying to freak us out." Or giving us ideas, Ryan added with a nervous laugh that died quickly when Vincent's head swiveled in our direction, his eyes narrowing slightly. The trail eventually led to an overlook with a view of the entire camp below. The cluster of cabins, the main lodge, the lake now partially obscured by mist. Vincent instructed us to take a break, drink water, and appreciate the perspective. As the others chatted and rested, I wandered a few yards away, seeking a better vantage point. The ground dropped off sharply beyond some rocks, creating a small cliff face that wasn't visible from the main trail. As I peered over the edge, something caught my eye. A small cave or crevice in the rock face below. And something moved inside it. Something pale. I leaned forward, trying to get a better look, when a hand clamped down on my shoulder with surprising strength. I nearly lost my balance, my heart leaping into my throat. "Dangerous," Vincent said, pulling me back from the edge. His fingers dug into my shoulder painfully. "One slip and we'd be scraping what's left of you off those rocks." He kept his hand in place as he leaned forward slightly, his eyes scanning the cliff face below. When he straightened up, his expression had changed, hardened somehow. "Stay with the group," he said flatly. "No wandering." For the remainder of the hike, Vincent positioned himself behind me, allowing the other boys to lead the way back to camp. I could feel his presence like a physical weight, his eyes boring into my back. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, he was there, watching with that same flat expression. Back at camp, we had an hour before lunch. Most of the boys headed to the lake to skip stones, but I needed some space from Vincent's oppressive presence. I told Theo I wanted to rest in the cabin, but instead, I made my way to the camp office, a small building attached to the main lodge. Ms. Winters was inside, reviewing paperwork. She looked up with mild surprise when I entered. "Can I help you?" she asked, setting down her pen. I hadn't planned what to say. How could I articulate my vague suspicions without sounding paranoid? Vincent hadn't actually done anything explicitly wrong or threatening. His behavior was odd, unsettling, but was it reportable? "I was just wondering," I began hesitantly, "about our counselor, Vincent, Miss." Winter's expression shifted slightly, a brief tightening around the eyes that vanished so quickly I might have imagined it. "What about him? How long has he worked here?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "This is his second summer," she replied, her tone measured. "He came highly recommended from Lakeside Camp in Vermont." "Oh, that wasn't what I expected." "And he's qualified? For working with teenagers, I mean." Ms. Winters folded her hands on the desk, studying me with new interest. "Vincent passed all the necessary background checks and certifications, if that's what you're asking. Is there a specific concern you'd like to share?" I hesitated. Put into words, my feelings about Vincent seemed childish, based more on instinct than evidence. "He just seems intense, different from the other counselors." "Different doesn't mean unqualified," Ms. Winters said, her tone softening slightly. "Vincent has his own approach to mentoring, but he's excellent at maintaining safety and order. Some of our most positive feedback last year came from his cabin." I nodded, not entirely reassured but unsure how to press further without revealing the extent of my discomfort. As I turned to leave, Ms. Winters called after me. "If there's ever a specific incident that concerns you, my door is always open," she said. The emphasis on specific was subtle but clear. Vague unease wasn't enough to warrant action. As I exited the office, I nearly collided with a figure standing just outside the door. Vincent, his arms crossed, expression unreadable. "Looking for something?" he asked, his voice eerily calm. "Just checking the activity schedule for tomorrow," I lied, heart hammering in my chest. Had he heard my conversation with Ms. Winters? "Interesting," he said, drawing out the word, "since the schedule is posted on the board by the dining hall, not in the office." Before I could formulate a response, the lunch bell rang, saving me from having to explain further. Vincent gestured toward the dining hall with an exaggerated sweep of his arm. "After you," he said, the ghost of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Wouldn't want you to miss lunch. You'll need your strength for this afternoon's activities." Something in the way he emphasized strength made my stomach clench. As I walked ahead of him toward the dining hall, I could feel his eyes on me, calculating, assessing. Whatever suspicions I had about Vincent, I was now certain of one thing. He had similar suspicions about me. And in this isolated environment, far from home and under his authority, that realization terrified me more than any strange behavior he had exhibited thus far. Wednesday afternoon brought brief respite from Vincent's constant presence. After lunch, the cabin groups were split up for specialized activities based on individual preferences. I had signed up for nature photography, hoping it would give me some time alone to clear my head and process everything that had happened. Theo chose rock climbing instead, leaving me on my own for the first time since we'd arrived at Pine Ridge. The photography group was small, just 6 of us plus a counselor named Ben, a cheerful guy with sun-bleached hair and the perpetual tan of someone who lived outdoors. His easy manner and genuine enthusiasm were a stark contrast to Vincent's clinical detachment, making the difference all the more obvious. Ben led us to a trail that followed a small river feeding into the lake. "The light here is perfect this time of day," he explained, adjusting settings on his own camera. "And there's tons of wildlife if you're patient." We spread out along the riverbank, each seeking our own subjects to photograph. I wandered farther downstream, relieved to be away from constant supervision and the growing tension in Cabin 7. The sound of running water soothed my frayed nerves, and for the first time in days I felt myself relaxing. I was crouching to photograph a cluster of wildflowers when I heard someone approach from behind. Turning, I expected to see Ben checking on my progress. Instead, I found Ivy, the auburn-haired girl from the dining hall, camera in hand. "Sorry," she said, offering an apologetic smile. "Didn't mean to startle you. Ben said we could spread out as long as we stayed within sight of the river." "No problem," I replied, surprised at how steady my voice sounded despite the sudden acceleration of my heartbeat. Up close, I could see that her eyes were hazel, flecked with gold in the dappled sunlight filtering through the trees. "I've seen you around," she continued, stepping closer to examine the flowers I'd been photographing. "You're in Cabin 7, right? With Vincent?" Something in her tone when she said Vincent's name caught my attention, a slight hesitation perhaps, or a subtle change in pitch. "Yeah," I confirmed, watching her expression carefully. "Do you know him?" Ivy straightened, her gaze shifting to the river. "Not really. He was here last summer too, but he mostly kept to himself." She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "Some of the girls thought he was, intense." "That's one way to put it," I said, grateful for the opportunity to discuss Vincent with someone who might share my concerns. "He's definitely different from the other counselors." Ivy nodded, absent-mindedly tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "There was an incident last year," she said, her voice lowering slightly even though no one else was within earshot. "Nothing official or anything, but this girl in my cabin, Amber, said she woke up one night and saw him standing at the window of our cabin, just watching." The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I remembered Vincent's silhouette outside our cabin window. "Did she report it?" "To who? Ms. Winters? She thinks Vincent walks on water. Besides, what would she say? I think I saw a counselor outside at night. It's not exactly criminal." Ivy sighed, then forced a smile. "Anyway, I'm probably being dramatic. Camp breeds ghost stories, right?" I wanted to tell her about everything I'd observed. Vincent's night wanderings, his fixation on death and danger, the cave in the cliff face, his reaction when I visited the office, but something held me back. Saying it aloud would make it real, would transform my nebulous unease into concrete accusations, and if Vincent had already noticed my suspicions, drawing Ivy into it might put her at risk as well. Instead, I suggested we move farther downstream where the river widened into a small pool edged with smooth stones, a perfect spot for photography. As we walked, the conversation shifted to lighter topics: our schools, our hobbies, our reasons for coming to Pine Ridge. Ivy was from a town about 2 hours away and had been coming to the camp since she was 12. Photography was a recent interest, sparked by a class she'd taken in school. For a while, I forgot about Vincent and the tension of the past few days. We took photos, compared techniques, and eventually settled on a large, flat rock by the water's edge to review our shots. The afternoon sun warmed the stone beneath us, and the gentle sound of the river created a peaceful backdrop. In that moment, Pine Ridge felt like the summer paradise it was meant to be rather than the setting for growing dread. "This one's amazing," Ivy said, showing me a photo she'd taken of a water strider skimming across the surface of the pool, its shadow perfectly reflected below. I leaned closer to see her camera's display screen, suddenly aware of how near she was. The scent of her shampoo, something citrusy, mingling with the earthy smell of the forest. When I looked up from the camera, our faces were inches apart. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. Then I saw it, a figure standing motionless among the trees on the opposite bank. Even at this distance, I recognized the lanky silhouette, the distinctive posture. Vincent. I jerked back, adrenaline flooding my system. Ivy followed my gaze, her expression shifting from confusion to alarm when she spotted him. "Has he been there the whole time?" she whispered, instinctively moving closer to me. "I don't know," I admitted, unable to look away from Vincent's still form. "I didn't see him before." Vincent made no attempt to move or call out, despite the fact that he was clearly visible to us. He simply stood there, partially obscured by a pine tree, watching. "We should go back," Ivy said, quickly gathering her camera. "Ben will be looking for us." I nodded, suddenly very aware of how far we'd wandered from the main group. As we hurriedly collected our things, I raised a hand in Vincent's direction, a reluctant acknowledgement of his presence. He didn't respond, didn't wave back, didn't move a muscle. Just continued staring with that same flat intensity that had become so unsettlingly familiar. We retreated upstream, walking faster than necessary, checking over our shoulders every few yards. By the time we rejoined the photography group, my hands were shaking so badly I had to put my camera away. "You two went pretty far," Ben remarked when we returned, his tone casual but his eyes questioning. "Just following the good light," Ivy replied with forced nonchalance. "Did you get any good shots of the heron?" Ben launched into an enthusiastic description of the bird he'd photographed, and the moment passed. But as the group headed back toward camp, I noticed Ivy scanning the trees around us, her earlier ease replaced by vigilant tension. I found myself doing the same, expecting to glimpse Vincent's pale face watching from behind every trunk and boulder. Back at camp, as we approached the central clearing, Ivy pulled me aside briefly. "Be careful," she murmured, her eyes serious. "Vincent, there's something not right about him. I didn't want to say too much before, but Amber wasn't the only one who had weird experiences last year." Before I could ask for details, we were interrupted by the arrival of other campers streaming toward the dining hall for dinner. Ivy squeezed my arm once, then disappeared into the crowd, leaving me with more questions than answers, and a growing certainty that my instincts about Vincent weren't mere paranoia. At dinner, I searched for Vincent among the counselors' table but didn't see him. Theo slid onto the bench beside me, his face flushed with excitement from rock climbing. "Dude, you missed it," he enthused, piling mashed potatoes onto his plate. "I made it all the way to the top of the advanced wall. Even Joey said it was impressive, and he never compliments anyone." I nodded absently, only half listening as I continued scanning the dining hall. "Hello? Earth to Space Cadet?" Theo said, waving a hand in front of my face. "What's with you? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Not a ghost," I said quietly. "Vincent. He was watching me and Ivy by the river today, just standing there staring. It was extremely disturbing." Theo's expression sobered. "Okay, that is weird. But maybe he was just checking on you, making sure you were safe." "From across the river? Without saying anything?" I shook my head. "No way. There's something seriously off about him, Theo. Ivy said there were incidents last year, too." "What kind of incidents?" I started to explain what Ivy had told me, but movement near the entrance caught my eye. Vincent had entered the dining hall and was scanning the tables, his gaze methodical and searching. When his eyes landed on me, he paused, then changed direction, heading straight for our table. "He's coming over," I whispered urgently to Theo. "Don't mention any of this." Vincent slid onto the bench across from us, his tray holding a precisely arranged meal. Foods separated into distinct sections, not touching. "Productive afternoon?" he asked, his eyes fixed on me with uncomfortable intensity. "Yeah," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Photography was great." "I saw you by the river," he said, cutting a piece of chicken into a perfect square. "With the girl from cabin 3. The way he said it, flat, emotionless, made it sound like an accusation rather than an observation. "Ivy?" I supplied, refusing to be intimidated despite the rapid beating of my heart. "She's in the photography group too." Vincent nodded slowly, placing the precisely cut piece of chicken in his mouth and chewing with deliberate care before speaking again. "You went quite far downstream," he noted, "beyond the designated activity area." "Ben said it was fine as long as we stayed near the river," I countered, remembering Ivy's words. "Ben isn't your assigned counselor," Vincent replied, his voice taking on a slight edge. "I am, and I'm responsible for your safety." We were perfectly safe, I insisted, growing increasingly uncomfortable under his unblinking stare. "Were you?" Vincent's lips curved into what might have been a smile on anyone else, but on him looked more like a grimace. "The river gets treacherous beyond that bend. The current is stronger than it looks. People have drowned there." His emphasis on drowned sent a chill through me. Was it a warning or a threat? "We were careful," I said, willing my voice not to shake. Vincent held my gaze for several long seconds before returning his attention to his food, methodically cutting another perfect square of chicken. "Tomorrow's activity is survival skills," he said, changing the subject abruptly. "Be prepared for extended time in the woods. Bring a water bottle and suitable footwear." He looked up, his eyes moving between Theo and me. "And stay with the group at all times. It's easy to get lost out there if you wander off." The implied threat was unmistakable. As Vincent finished his meal and left the table, Theo leaned closer to me. "Okay," he admitted in a low voice. "That was definitely creepy. Maybe we should talk to Ms. Winters again together this time." I nodded, but doubt gnawed at me. Ms. Winters had already dismissed my concerns once. Without concrete evidence, would a second complaint make any difference? And if Vincent found out we'd reported him again, what might he do? The dining hall suddenly felt too crowded, too loud. Through the windows, I could see darkness settling over the camp, transforming the familiar grounds into shadowy territory where anything might lurk. In less than an hour, we would be back in cabin 7, trapped with Vincent through another long night. And I was becoming increasingly certain that Vincent had plans for us. Plans that had nothing to do with the official camp activities and everything to do with whatever dark impulses drove him to watch, wait, and isolate those who noticed his behavior. Thursday morning dawned with a heavy fog that clung to the camp like a shroud, reducing visibility to mere yards and muffling sounds. The effect was disorienting. Familiar pathways became mysterious, and the normal bustle of camp activities seemed distant and surreal. I had slept poorly, waking frequently to check that Vincent was in his bunk. He had been there each time I looked, lying unnaturally still with his eyes closed, though whether he was actually sleeping was impossible to tell. Once, around 3 a.m., I thought I heard the soft scratch of pencil on paper, but when I cautiously raised my head to look, Vincent appeared motionless. The cabin dark and quiet save for the breathing of the other boys. Breakfast was a subdued affair. The fog had dampened everyone's spirits, and the announcement that most outdoor activities would be limited due to poor visibility didn't help. Instead of survival skills in the woods, our cabin would be confined to camp boundaries for the morning, participating in team-building exercises on the playing field near the lodge. Vincent seemed unusually agitated by the change in plans. He kept checking his watch and staring out the windows at the thick fog as if willing it to disperse. When Ms. Winters approached him with revised activity schedules, I overheard fragments of their conversation. "Not safe conditions for what I had planned," Ms. Winters was saying. "They need to learn to navigate in all conditions," Vincent responded, his voice tense. "Controlling the environment defeats the purpose." "Safety comes first, Vincent," Ms. Winters said firmly. "We'll reassess after lunch if the fog lifts." Vincent's expression darkened, but he nodded stiffly and returned to our table, informing us of the change with obvious displeasure. The team-building exercises were standard camp fare, trust falls, Human knots, blindfolded obstacle courses. Vincent observed rather than participated, standing at the edge of the field with his arms crossed, occasionally making notes in his black notebook. His mood seemed to deteriorate as the morning progressed, his few instructions delivered in clipped tones. During a water break, Jake, one of the quieter boys in our cabin, approached me while I was refilling my bottle at a drinking fountain. "Hey," he said, glancing around to ensure no one was within earshot. "Is it just me, or is Vincent extra weird today?" "Definitely not just you," I confirmed, relieved that someone else had noticed. "He's been off all week, but today seems worse." Jake nodded, fidgeting with the hem of his t-shirt. "Last night I got up to use the bathroom around 2, and I saw him sitting on his bunk just staring at us. Not doing anything, just watching everyone sleep." He shuddered slightly at the memory, and when he saw that I was awake, he put his finger to his lips like he was telling me to be quiet. It really freaked me out. A cold weight settled in my stomach. "Have you told anyone else?" "No," Jake admitted. "I thought maybe I was overreacting, or that I dreamed it." "You didn't," I assured him, then hesitated before adding, "There's more. He's been following me, watching me when he thinks I don't notice, and there was this incident by the river yesterday." I quickly recounted what had happened with Ivy, watching Jake's expression shift from concern to alarm. "We should tell Ms. Winters," he said when I finished. "All of us who've noticed weird stuff. She can't ignore multiple reports, right?" "I already tried," I said, explaining my earlier conversation with the camp director. "She basically said Vincent is eccentric but qualified." Jake's face fell. "So what do we do? There's still 3 more days until pickup." "I'm working on it," I promised, though in truth I had no plan beyond increased vigilance. "For now, stick with the group, don't be alone with him, and tell me if you notice anything else strange." Jake agreed, and we rejoined the others for the final exercise before lunch. As we approached, Vincent's eyes locked onto us, narrowing slightly as if he sensed we'd been discussing him. He made a show of checking his notebook, then announced the next activity. A blindfolded challenge where one team member would guide their blindfolded partner through a series of obstacles using only verbal instructions. "Jake and our photographer here will demonstrate first," Vincent declared, holding out a blindfold. The way he emphasized photographer made it clear this wasn't a random selection. Jake shot me a nervous glance as Vincent approached him with the blindfold. "Actually," a voice interrupted, "I need to borrow Jake for a moment." Ms. Winters had appeared at the edge of the field, clipboard in hand. "We're rearranging some of the afternoon activities, and I need to confirm his preferences." Vincent's jaw tightened visibly, but he nodded, redirecting his attention to me. "It seems you need a new partner," he said, his voice deceptively mild. "I'll guide you myself." A protest rose in my throat, but before I could voice it, Vincent was already securing the blindfold over my eyes. The fabric was thick, blocking all light and disorienting me immediately. I felt Vincent's cold hands adjusting the knot at the back of my head, pulling it tighter than necessary. "Trust is essential in survival situations," Vincent said, his voice close to my ear. "When you can't rely on sight, you must depend entirely on others to guide you safely." The emphasis on safely sent a chill down my back. As Vincent led me toward what I assumed was the obstacle course, his hand gripped my upper arm with unnecessary force. 3 steps forward, he instructed, his voice now coming from behind me. I complied hesitantly, arms outstretched for balance. "Now right, 2 steps. I turned and stepped as directed, acutely aware of how vulnerable I was. The sounds of the other campers seemed to fade, as if Vincent had deliberately led me away from the group. "Stop," he commanded sharply. I froze. "There's a log in front of you. Step over it, lifting your foot high." I raised my foot cautiously, feeling nothing beneath it. Had I cleared the obstacle? Before I could ask, Vincent spoke again, his voice suddenly much closer. "You didn't visit the office again yesterday," he said, the non sequitur catching me off guard. "After our chat by the river, I thought you might have more concerns to share with Ms. Winters." My mouth went dry. "No," I managed. "No concerns." "Good," Vincent replied, and I could hear the smile in his voice, though I couldn't see it. "Because concerns can be dangerous, especially unfounded ones." "Where's the next obstacle?" I asked, desperate to redirect the conversation. "Patience," Vincent said. "Before we continue, I want to make something clear. I've noticed you watching me just as I watch you. It's what counselors do. Observe, assess, identify potential problems before they arise. His hand returned to my arm, fingers pressing into the same spot where he'd gripped me before. I would later discover bruises there, 5 distinct fingerprints marked on my skin. But your observations are incomplete, he continued. You see only fragments without context. It leads to misunderstandings. I began, but Vincent cut me off. 3 steps left, then duck, he ordered, abruptly resuming the exercise. I complied, still unsure what obstacles I was avoiding, if any existed at all. Now reach out in front of you. There's a rope hanging. Grab it and use it to guide yourself forward. I extended my hands, finding nothing but air. I don't feel anything. It's there, Vincent insisted, his voice hardening. Reach farther. I stretched my arms to their full extent, still encountering nothing. A growing suspicion that there was no rope, perhaps no obstacle course at all, filled me with fresh anxiety. What was Vincent's goal here? I still don't... Because you're not trying, Vincent hissed, suddenly directly beside me. Your lack of trust is the problem. If you trusted me properly, you'd find what you're looking for. His breath was hot against my ear, his voice dropping to a whisper. Do you know what happens to campers who don't trust their counselors? Who spread stories? Who create division? They get lost. And in these woods, lost means, what's going on over here? The sharp voice of Ms. Winters cut through whatever Vincent had been about to say. I tore off the blindfold to find we were indeed far from the main group, standing near the edge of the forest. The rest of Cabin 7 was visible in the distance, engaged in the actual obstacle course on the playing field. Vincent stepped away from me smoothly. Just demonstrating an alternative approach to the blindfold exercise, he explained, his demeanor shifting instantly to professional detachment. Using natural obstacles rather than artificial ones. Ms. Winters frowned, looking between us. All activities need to remain within view of the main field today, Vincent. You know the fog protocol. Of course, he agreed, his voice neutral. An oversight on my part. As we walked back toward the group, Ms. Winters beside us, I glanced at Vincent. His expression revealed nothing, but there was a tension in his posture, a coiled energy that hadn't been there before. You'll need to check in with Nurse Patel, Ms. Winters told me when we reached the field. Standard procedure after any deviation from planned activities. I seized the opportunity to escape Vincent's presence, following Ms. Winters toward the infirmary building. As we walked, I gathered my courage. Ms. Winters, I began, about Vincent. Nurse Patel will address any concerns, she interrupted, her tone businesslike but not unkind. That's why we have these protocols. Something in her manner, a certain wariness perhaps, made me wonder if she suspected more than she had acknowledged. At the infirmary door, she paused. Vincent has unique methods, she said carefully, but until today he's been scrupulous about following safety guidelines. I'll be keeping a closer eye on his activities. It wasn't the full acknowledgement I'd hoped for, but it was something, an indication that Vincent's behavior had finally triggered official notice. Nurse Patel, a brisk woman with kind eyes, checked me over efficiently, noting the finger-shaped marks beginning to form on my arm with a frown. How did these happen? She asked, gently probing the tender skin. Vincent grabbed me during the blindfold exercise, I explained. He was guiding me. She made a note on her clipboard, her expression carefully neutral. And did he say anything unusual during this exercise? The direct question surprised me. He implied that campers who don't trust counselors get lost in the woods, I admitted, watching her reaction closely. Nurse Patel's pen paused momentarily, then continued writing. Anything else? I described the entire incident, including how Vincent had led me away from the group and the mind games with non-existent obstacles. With each detail, her frown deepened. Thank you for being thorough, she said when I finished. You're cleared to return to activities, but if you experience any discomfort or additional concerns, come back immediately. As I left the infirmary, I caught sight of her picking up a phone, her expression grave. A tiny flicker of hope ignited in my chest. Perhaps someone was finally taking the situation seriously. The fog had begun to lift by lunchtime, patches of blue sky visible through thinning mist. The improved weather brought a collective lifting of spirits among the campers. But I remained on edge, watching Vincent across the dining hall as he conferred with two other counselors, his manner subdued. I sought out Theo, who had been engaged in a different activity all morning, and filled him in on everything that had happened. His usual skepticism was gone, replaced by genuine concern. "That's assault," he said, eyeing the marks on my arm. "They have to do something now." "I'm not sure they will," I replied. "Or at least not quickly enough. Something's happening soon, Theo." Vincent had specific plans for today that got derailed by the fog. He was really upset about it. "What kind of plans?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But they involve taking us deep into the woods, away from supervision." Theo's expression darkened. "We need to stick together, all of us from the cabin. Safety in numbers, right?" I nodded, though I wasn't convinced even that would be enough. Throughout lunch, I could feel Vincent's eyes on me, calculating, reassessing. Whatever game he was playing, the rules had changed, and I had a sinking feeling that I had accelerated his timeline rather than derailed it. The afternoon brought more structured activities within camp boundaries, with Vincent notably absent. Ms. Winters explained that he was attending to administrative matters, but the careful way she avoided elaborating suggested there was more to the story. I spotted Ivy during an arts and crafts session and managed to speak with her briefly, updating her on the morning's events. "They're questioning him," she revealed in a hushed voice. "Amber saw him going into the administrative cabin with Ms. Winters and some guy in a polo shirt she didn't recognize." "Good," I said, relief washing over me. "Maybe they'll send him home." Ivy's expression remained troubled. "Maybe, but if they don't, if he comes back," she didn't need to finish the thought. "I'll be careful," I promised. "We all will." As dinner approached, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, promising rain overnight. The darkening sky seemed an apt metaphor for the mounting tension I felt. Vincent still hadn't returned, his absence at the counselors' table conspicuous. Rumors spread quickly through the camp. Vincent had been fired, he'd quit, he'd been arrested. Each version more dramatic than the last. I didn't believe any of them. Something told me Vincent wouldn't leave so easily, wouldn't relinquish whatever plans he had set in motion. Back in Cabin 7 that evening, a temporary counselor named Greg supervised our nighttime routine, explaining that Vincent was taking care of personal matters and would return tomorrow. Greg was everything Vincent wasn't: cheerful, talkative, genuinely interested in our camp experiences. Under different circumstances, his presence would have been a welcome relief. Instead, it felt like the calm before a storm. As I lay in my bunk that night, listening to the first raindrops pattering against the cabin roof, I couldn't shake the conviction that Vincent was out there somewhere in the darkness, watching, waiting, planning his next move. I must have eventually fallen asleep despite my anxiety, because I jerked awake sometime in the deepest part of the night, disoriented and unsure what had roused me. The cabin was dark and quiet, rain now falling steadily outside. Greg's gentle snoring came from Vincent's usual bunk by the door. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate tapping on the window nearest my bed. 3 distinct taps, a pause, then 3 more. Frozen with fear, I stared into the darkness, barely breathing. The tapping came again, more insistent this time. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window, half expecting to see Vincent's pale face pressed against the glass. Instead, there was only darkness and the streaming rivulets of rain. But as lightning briefly illuminated the night, I caught a glimpse of something white affixed to the outside of the window, a piece of paper, rapidly becoming sodden in the downpour. My instinct was to wake Theo or Greg, but curiosity overcame fear. I slipped silently from my bunk and approached the window, straining to make out what was written on the paper. Another flash of lightning revealed a message in neat, precise handwriting. "Meet me at the boathouse, come alone, information about Vincent." The note wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. Only one person at camp knew about my suspicions and might have information to share: Ivy. But why the boathouse? Why in the middle of the night during a storm? Logic told me to ignore the note, to return to bed and wait for morning. But the possibility of learning something concrete about Vincent, something that might finally convince the camp administration to remove him permanently, was too tempting to dismiss. I stood at the window for long minutes debating. Safety in numbers, Theo had said, but waking him or Greg would mean explaining the note, which would likely result in both of them insisting we ignore it or report it officially. Options that might mean losing whatever information Ivy had discovered. Decision made. I quietly dressed, pulled on a rain jacket, and slipped my flashlight into my pocket. The cabin door creaked slightly as I eased it open, but Greg's snoring continued uninterrupted. Outside, the rain fell in sheets, instantly soaking my pants despite the jacket's protection. The path to the boathouse was dark and slippery, visibility reduced to mere feet ahead. This was madness, I told myself as I carefully picked my way down the muddy trail. What kind of vital information couldn't wait until morning? Yet I continued, driven by a mix of curiosity and the growing conviction that time was running out, that whatever Vincent had planned was imminent. The boathouse loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the storm-lashed lake. Its wooden structure creaked and groaned in the wind, an eerie chorus that raised goosebumps on my arms despite the relative warmth of the summer night. The door stood slightly ajar, a thin line of light visible from within. "Ivy?" I called softly, pushing the door open wider. The interior was dimly lit by a single battery-powered lantern placed on the floor near the back, illuminating the upturned hulls of canoes stored for the night. "Are you here?" No response. I stepped fully inside, relieved to be out of the rain, but increasingly uneasy. The boathouse smelled of damp wood and mildew, the sound of water slapping against the dock beneath the floorboards creating a rhythmic counterpoint to the rain on the roof. "Hello?" I tried again, taking a few more steps inside. "Ivy, is anyone here?" The door slammed shut behind me with a force that couldn't have been merely the wind. I whirled around, heart hammering in my chest, as the lantern's light glinted off a familiar tall figure now standing between me and the exit. "Curious," Vincent said, his voice eerily calm above the storm's clamor. "I left that note over an hour ago. I was beginning to think you wouldn't come." The air in the boathouse seemed to thicken, making each breath a conscious effort. Vincent remained by the door, his silhouette backlit by occasional flashes of lightning through the small windows. Water streamed from his rain-soaked clothes, forming a dark puddle at his feet. "Where's Ivy?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady despite the fear clawing at my throat. My eyes darted around the dimly lit space, searching for escape routes. Vincent tilted his head slightly, regarding me with clinical interest. "Ivy, she's not here. She was never here." A smile spread across his face, devoid of warmth. "Did you think she sent that note?" An interesting assumption. My mind raced. If Ivy hadn't sent the note, if this was Vincent's trap all along, why had I so readily believed otherwise? The answer came with sickening clarity. Because I wanted to believe someone had information that could help. Because I'd underestimated Vincent's cunning. "What do you want?" I asked, taking a step backward as Vincent moved away from the door, circling slowly to my right. "A chance to clear up misunderstandings," he replied, his tone conversational as if we were chatting over breakfast. "You've been watching me, asking questions, spreading concerns among the other campers." He sighed, a theatrical sound. "It's becoming disruptive." "I haven't spread anything," I countered, continuing to back away, keenly aware of the layout of the boathouse. The heavy canoes suspended from the ceiling, the equipment racks lining the walls, the narrow walkway leading to the dock door at the rear. "I've just noticed things." "Yes, you notice a great deal," Vincent acknowledged, his pace matching mine, maintaining a consistent distance between us. "More than most. That's what caught my attention first. Your awareness, your vigilance." He pronounced the word with something like admiration. Most teenagers are oblivious to their surroundings, absorbed in their phones, their social dramas, their petty concerns. But not you. A flash of lightning illuminated his face fully for an instant. The hollow cheeks, the intense eyes, the smile that never reached them. In that moment, he looked more predatory than human. "Why did you bring me here?" I asked, desperately trying to buy time to formulate a plan. The dock door was my best option. But Vincent seemed to anticipate this, his movements deliberately herding me away from that escape route. "To talk, without interruption or interference," Vincent replied. "Ms. Winters and her associate had many questions today about my methods, my background, my interactions with campers." His expression hardened. "Questions inspired by your visit to the infirmary, no doubt." "You hurt me," I said, rubbing my arm where the bruises still marked his grip. Nurse Patel was doing her job. Vincent waved dismissively. A misunderstanding. I was ensuring your safety during the exercise. He took another step closer, forcing me to retreat further into the shadows at the back of the boathouse. But these concerns have complicated my position here. Accelerated certain timelines. The way he said timelines sent fresh adrenaline coursing through my system. Whatever Vincent had planned, it was happening now tonight, triggered by the administrative intervention earlier in the day. They'll notice I'm gone, I said, grasping for leverage. Greg will check the bunks. They'll come looking. Eventually, Vincent conceded with a small nod, but not until morning. And by then, our lesson will be complete. Lesson? The word hung in the air between us, ominous in its ambiguity. Vincent's expression shifted, becoming almost earnest. That's what this has always been about, teaching. Not the superficial lessons of summer camp, how to paddle a canoe or string a bow, but the essential lessons of survival. Of awareness, he gestured around the dark boathouse. Like this moment. A test of your ability to recognize danger, to respond appropriately. By luring me out alone in the middle of the night? I countered, anger briefly overriding fear. That's not teaching, that's... What? Vincent interrupted, his voice suddenly sharp. Predatory, criminal? Choose your words carefully. You came here voluntarily, driven by your own curiosity and hubris. He wasn't wrong, and that realization stung. I had walked into his trap, ignoring every warning sign, every instinct that had served me well until now. What happened at Lakeside Camp? I asked, a sudden intuition guiding the question. In Vermont, before you came here. Vincent went very still, his eyes narrowing almost imperceptibly. What do you know about Lakeside? Ms. Winters said you came highly recommended from there, I said, watching his reaction closely. But something happened, didn't it? Something like this. For the first time, Vincent's composure slipped, a flash of something, anger, fear, crossing his features before the mask of calm returned. Lakeside was educational, for everyone involved. What does that mean? I pressed, sensing I'd found a vulnerable point. Vincent ignored the question, abruptly changing tactics. He moved suddenly to the right, cutting off my slow progress toward the equipment racks where I'd spotted a potential weapon, a heavy paddle hanging on the wall. Enough about the past, he said. Let's focus on the present, on your current predicament. He gestured toward the door. You could run. Try to make it back to your cabin before I catch you. The rain would cover any noise. The implicit threat hung in the air between us. Vincent stood between me and the main door, and though the dock door remained a possibility, I'd have to get past him or risk being trapped on the dock with nowhere to go but the storm-tossed lake. Or, Vincent continued when I didn't respond, you could listen, learn, understand what this has all been about. Which is what exactly? I asked, desperately scanning the boathouse for anything that might help me. My gaze landed on a red emergency alarm box near the main door, too far away to reach, but its presence confirmed that the boathouse had safety protocols in place. Vincent smiled, seemingly pleased by the question. Recognition. Potential. In all my years working with teenagers, I've encountered very few with your level of awareness, your instinctive understanding of danger. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to an intimate murmur despite the storm's noise. From the moment you arrived, you sensed what I was, what I could do. The hairs on my arm stood on end, not from cold but from the clinical detachment with which Vincent discussed my potential, as if I were a specimen to be studied rather than a person to be protected. And what exactly are you? I asked, stalling while I inched toward a stack of life jackets piled on a bench, thinking they might provide some protection if Vincent attacked. A teacher, he replied simply. One who understands that true learning doesn't come from safe, structured activities. It comes from fear, from danger, from confronting the darkest aspects of human nature. His eyes gleamed in the dim light, from recognizing predators before they strike. In that moment, everything clicked into place. Vincent's obsession with danger, his isolation of vulnerable campers, the tests and mind games. He saw himself not as a threat but as some twisted kind of mentor, teaching survival through terror, "You're sick," I said, the words escaping before I could reconsider. "You need help." Vincent's expression darkened. That's what they said at Lakeside. That's what they always say when they don't understand. He moved suddenly, closing the distance between us with alarming speed. "But you understand, don't you? You've felt it. The heightened awareness, the clarity that comes with fear. I've watched you these past days, seen how your senses have sharpened, how quickly you've learned to recognize threats." I backed away until I felt the rough wood of the wall behind me. Vincent stood less than an arm's length away now, his breathing quick and shallow with excitement or anger, I couldn't tell which. "This isn't teaching," I insisted, desperately searching for words that might reach whatever rationality remained in his disturbed mind. "Teaching is about trust, about safety, not whatever this is." "Trust?" Vincent scoffed. "Safety? Those are illusions, comforting lies we tell children. The world isn't safe. It's full of people like me, watching, waiting, selecting." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "And most people never notice until it's too late. But you noticed. From the beginning, you saw me. A plan was forming in my mind, not elegant, but born of desperate necessity. The heavy flashlight in my pocket. The emergency alarm by the door. The dock behind me. If I could momentarily blind Vincent, make a dash for the alarm. So what now?" I asked, hand slipping into my pocket to grip the flashlight. "What happens when your lesson is over?" Vincent straightened, considering the question with apparent sincerity. "That depends on you. On what you've learned. On whether you've earned the right to carry this knowledge forward." The implication was clear. If Vincent decided I hadn't learned properly, I wouldn't be leaving the boathouse at all. The storm would provide cover, the lake a convenient disposal site. My heart hammered painfully against my ribs as I realized the full extent of the danger I was in. "And if I have learned?" I managed to ask, fingers tightening around the flashlight. "Then perhaps you become the teacher," Vincent replied, his expression brightening with an almost religious fervor. "Perhaps you carry forward this understanding, this awareness." "Perhaps." I didn't wait for him to finish. In one fluid motion, I yanked the flashlight from my pocket, switched it on, and shone the bright beam directly into Vincent's eyes. He recoiled instinctively, raising an arm to shield his face, and I seized the moment to lunge past him, aiming for the main door. But Vincent recovered faster than I anticipated. His hand shot out, grabbing the hood of my rain jacket and yanking me backward with enough force to tear the fabric. I stumbled off balance, and he used the momentum to slam me against the wall, knocking the wind from my lungs. The flashlight clattered to the floor, rolling away and casting wild shadows across the boathouse. Vincent's face loomed close to mine, all pretense of calm instruction gone, replaced by cold fury. "That," he hissed, "was disappointing. After everything I've invested in your education." His hand closed around my throat, not squeezing, but present. A threat, a promise. With my back literally against the wall, options disappearing by the second, I did the only thing I could think of. I brought my knee up sharply, connecting with Vincent's groin with as much force as I could muster. The effect was instantaneous. Vincent doubled over with a guttural sound of pain, his grip on my throat releasing as he staggered backward. I didn't hesitate. I bolted for the door, yanking it open and throwing myself out into the storm. Rain lashed at my face as I ran, the muddy path treacherous underfoot. Behind me, I heard the boathouse door slam open again, followed by Vincent's voice raised to a shout, for the first time since I'd known him. "You can't escape this," he called after me, his words nearly lost in a crash of thunder. "The lesson isn't over." I didn't look back, focusing all my energy on the path ahead, on reaching the safety of the main camp. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the grounds, the dark shapes of cabins, the looming trees, the puddles rapidly becoming small ponds in the torrential downpour. My lungs burned, my legs threatened to give out, but terror drove me forward. The lights of the main lodge appeared through the rain, a beacon of hope. Someone was still awake despite the late hour. I changed course, heading for the lighted windows rather than my dark cabin. Behind me, I could hear splashing footsteps, Vincent in pursuit. The lodge steps were slick with rain, and I nearly fell as I scrambled up them, throwing myself against the heavy wooden door. It didn't budge. Locked. I pounded frantically, screaming for help over the storm's roar. "Help! Please, someone help me!" Vincent's figure emerged from the darkness at the base of the steps, moving with deliberate purpose despite his obvious pain. His face, illuminated by another flash of lightning, was transformed by rage, all pretense of the controlled counselor stripped away to reveal something feral beneath. "No one can hear you," he called, starting up the steps. "The storm's too loud. We can continue our lesson elsewhere." Desperation lending me strength, I ran along the lodge's covered porch, trying each window, looking for any way in. The third window yielded slightly, not locked. I forced my fingers into the narrow gap and pushed upward with all my might. The window groaned, then slid up enough for me to squeeze through. I tumbled into what appeared to be the lodge kitchen, knocking over a chair in the process. The noise seemed deafening after the constant roar of the storm. I scrambled to my feet, dripping water onto the linoleum floor, and rushed toward the door that would lead to the main hall. Before I could reach it, the door swung open, revealing a startled Ms. Winters in a bathrobe, a baseball bat clutched in her hands. "What on earth?" she began, then registered my soaked appearance, my wild eyes, my gasping breath. "What happened?" "Vincent," I managed between desperate gulps of air. "Boathouse. Trapped me. Tried to—" I couldn't finish, the reality of what had nearly happened hitting me all at once. Ms. Winters' expression hardened. She reached for a phone on the wall, dialing quickly. "Stay here," she instructed, her voice calm but authoritative. "Don't move." As she spoke rapidly into the phone, I sank to the floor, adrenaline ebbing to leave me shaking and nauseated. Through the window I'd entered, I could see the porch was empty, no sign of Vincent. Had he fled when he realized I'd gotten inside? Or was he still out there watching, waiting for another opportunity? The next hours passed in a blur. Security personnel arrived, followed by local police. I repeated my story multiple times. The note, the boathouse, Vincent's strange philosophy of teaching through fear, his threats, my escape. Somewhere in the midst of it all, dawn broke, the storm finally passing to leave a sodden, debris-strewn camp in its wake. They found evidence in the boathouse that corroborated my account. The lantern still burning, my broken flashlight on the floor, a torn piece of my jacket's hood. But of Vincent himself there was no sign. A search of his quarters revealed the black notebook, filled with detailed observations of multiple campers, not just me, but others he had identified as aware or potential candidates. Most disturbing were the final pages, where Vincent had outlined a graduation exercise scheduled for that night. Details vague but ominous, involving the boathouse, the lake, and tests of survival under extreme conditions. As morning fully arrived, parents were contacted, arrangements made for early pickups. Camp was effectively over, the idyllic summer experience shattered by the realization that a predator had been among us, hiding behind the facade of authority. Theo found me in the infirmary, where Nurse Patel had insisted I rest after giving my statement. His face was pale, his usual easygoing manner replaced by wide-eyed shock. "Is it true?" he asked, perching on the edge of the cot where I lay. "About Vincent? They're saying that he was planning to—" "It's true," I confirmed, too exhausted for euphemisms or sugarcoating. He had this twisted idea that he was teaching survival skills by creating real danger, by becoming the predator. Theo shook his head in disbelief. "And the police haven't found him?" "Not yet." The thought sent a chill through me despite the warm blanket Nurse Patel had provided. "They think he's long gone." That he ran when he realized I'd gotten away and raised the alarm. "But you don't believe that," Theo observed, reading my expression. I hesitated, then shook my head. "No, Vincent doesn't strike me as the type to just give up, not when he was so invested in his lesson." Theo's hand found mine, squeezing gently. "Well, he can't get to you now. There are police everywhere, and our parents will be here in a few hours." I nodded, wanting to believe he was right. But as I looked out the infirmary window at the campgrounds now crawling with authorities, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, that somewhere Vincent was watching, evaluating my response, considering it part of his twisted curriculum. That feeling would stay with me long after we left Pine Ridge, long after the police investigation concluded without finding Vincent, long after the summer faded into autumn and life supposedly returned to normal. It would wake me from nightmares, prompt me to check locked doors and windows, make me search crowds for a tall, pale figure with dead eyes. Because Vincent had been right about one thing. I had learned. I had become aware in ways I never would have chosen, and I would never feel entirely safe again. The next 24 hours passed in a chaotic blur of police statements, tearful parents arriving to collect their shaken children, and news vans gathering at the camp entrance like vultures sensing carrion. My parents arrived by mid-afternoon, my mother's face white with terror, my father uncharacteristically silent as I was released into their custody. The drive home was mostly quiet. I'd already told my story so many times, to Ms. Winters, to the police, to state troopers, to detectives, that my voice was hoarse and my mind numb. My parents respected this, limiting their questions to my immediate well-being rather than pressing for details of the night's events. "We're just glad you're safe," my mother said, reaching back from the passenger seat to squeeze my knee. Her hand trembled slightly, betraying the calm she was trying to project. "That's all that matters now." But I wasn't safe, not really. That was the lesson Vincent had taught me, the awareness he'd awakened that couldn't be unlearned. The world contained predators who watched and waited, who could wear masks of normalcy so convincing that institutions trusted them with children. And sometimes those predators chose you, saw something in you that caught their interest, marked you as different from the general herd. I didn't share these thoughts with my parents. Instead, I leaned my head against the car window, watching the familiar landscape of home replace the wilderness of Pine Ridge, and tried to convince myself that distance equaled safety. Home should have felt like a sanctuary, but it didn't. I found myself checking locks, scanning rooms before entering them, startling at unexpected sounds. Sleep became a luxury, interrupted by nightmares in which Vincent's pale face loomed out of darkness, his voice whispering about lessons unfinished, tests yet to come. 3 days after our return, Detective Garrett came to our house. She was a compact woman with shrewd eyes and a gentle manner that belied her obvious competence. She sat at our kitchen table, declining coffee but accepting water, and explained the status of the investigation. "We've identified him as Vincent Mercer, age 27, she began, placing a photograph on the table. Vincent's staff ID picture, his empty smile frozen in glossy color. His employment history is spotty, but he did work at Lakeside Camp in Vermont, as he claimed. What he didn't mention was that he left under suspicious circumstances after a camper reported similar behavior. Isolation, surveillance, psychological intimidation. Why wasn't he arrested then?" my father demanded, anger briefly overriding his usual restraint. Detective Garrett's expression tightened. The camper recanted his statement after Vincent confronted him privately. Without corroborating evidence or a complainant, the case was dropped. But Lakeside did terminate his employment. "So he just moved to another state and started over," my mother said, horror evident in her voice. "With a recommendation?" "Not exactly," the detective clarified. "The recommendation Pine Ridge received was forged. Vincent created a paper trail that seemed legitimate enough to pass a standard background check, but not the deeper investigation we're conducting now." She turned to me, her voice gentling. "I know you're tired of telling this story, but I need to ask you about something specific. In your statement, you mentioned Vincent talked about potential candidates and seemed to think you had some special awareness. Can you elaborate on that?" I tried to organize my thoughts to convey the essence of Vincent's disturbing philosophy. He said most people are oblivious to danger until it's too late, that they don't notice predators watching them. I swallowed hard, remembering his intensity in the boathouse. He seemed to think I was different because I noticed him, because I saw through whatever act he was putting on for everyone else. And this recognition made you valuable to him somehow? Detective Garrett pressed, watching me carefully. "I think he saw it as potential," I explained, struggling to articulate the concept. "Like he could shape me into something, turn me into someone like him, maybe." He talked about me becoming the teacher eventually. A shadow passed over the detective's face, quickly suppressed. "That aligns with what we found in his notebook and personal effects at the camp. Vincent appears to have developed an elaborate philosophy around identifying what he called naturally vigilant individuals and testing their responses to escalating threat scenarios." "Testing?" my father repeated, his voice hollow. "You mean terrorizing?" "Yes," Detective Garrett agreed simply. "The notebook contains observations on multiple campers across 2 summers, But your son's entries were by far the most extensive and recent. Vincent seemed particularly fixated on his reactions. The knowledge that I had been under such close, calculated surveillance made my skin crawl anew. I thought of all the times I'd felt watched, all the moments when Vincent had appeared silently, observing from a distance. "Have you found him?" I asked, the question that had been haunting me since that night in the boathouse. Detective Garrett's hesitation was answer enough, but she replied anyway. "Not yet. We've issued alerts across multiple states, frozen his known accounts, and are monitoring all possible points of contact. But Vincent appears to have prepared for this contingency. He had a go bag ready in his vehicle, which we found abandoned about 20 miles from the camp, and likely had alternate identification prepared. So he could be anywhere," my mother said, voicing the fear we all shared. "He could," the detective acknowledged, "but people like Vincent typically follow patterns. His focus on your son was intense and prolonged. That kind of fixation doesn't disappear overnight." The implication hung in the air, unspoken but understood. Vincent might come looking for me, might try to complete whatever twisted lesson he'd planned. Detective Garrett seemed to read this realization in our expressions. "We're taking precautions," she assured us. "Your house will have regular patrols, and we've alerted local authorities to maintain heightened awareness in your area. We're also providing a panic button system that connects directly to emergency dispatch." She pulled a small device from her pocket, demonstrating its function. "This is for you," she said, handing it to me. "Keep it with you at all times." The small weight of the panic button in my palm should have been reassuring, concrete evidence that I was being protected, that systems were in place to keep me safe. Instead, it felt like confirmation of my deepest fear, that Vincent was still out there, that the danger hadn't passed with my escape from the boathouse. As Detective Garrett prepared to leave, she paused at the door, her professional demeanor softening slightly. "For what it's worth," she said, meeting my eyes directly, "what you did that night, recognizing the danger, escaping, raising the alarm, it likely saved other campers from becoming Vincent's targets. That kind of awareness, that instinct you have, it's not something he can claim or corrupt. It's yours and it served you well." Her words stayed with me in the weeks that followed, a counterpoint to the fear that had become my constant companion. Perhaps there was value in the vigilance Vincent had tried to twist into something dark. Perhaps it could be reclaimed, redirected into something protective rather than paranoid. Summer faded into fall, and gradually, the acute terror began to subside into a more manageable wariness. I returned to school, moved through familiar routines, reconnected with friends who knew nothing of what had happened at Pine Ridge. The police patrols became less frequent as weeks passed without any sign of Vincent, though the panic button remained a constant presence in my pocket. Theo and I spoke often, our shared experience creating a bond that went beyond our previous friendship. He seemed to process the trauma differently, more outwardly, more verbally, talking through each detail as if repetition could render it harmless. I preferred to internalize, to analyze privately, to work through my fear in solitude. I also stayed in touch with Ivy, whose perspective as another of Vincent's observed campers helped me understand that his fixation hadn't been entirely unique to me. We compared notes, shared nightmares, and gradually built a fuller picture of Vincent's methodology across both summers he'd worked at Pine Ridge. "He started watching me last year," she told me during one of our video calls, her face serious on my laptop screen. "Nothing as intense as what you experienced, but the same pattern appearing unexpectedly, asking strange hypothetical questions about survival, testing boundaries. Why didn't you say something sooner?" I asked without accusation. Ivy shrugged, a helpless gesture. "For the same reason most people don't, I guess. It was weird, but not definitively threatening, and without proof." She trailed off, then added, "Plus, there's that thing where you start to doubt yourself, to wonder if you're overreacting." I understood exactly what she meant. That self-doubt had nearly cost me everything in the boathouse. "The investigators found a list in his stuff," I told her, sharing information Detective Garrett had recently disclosed. Names of campers he thought had potential. You were on it. So was Jake from my cabin. Ivy went quiet for a moment, absorbing this. "And you were at the top, I'm guessing." I nodded, the knowledge still unsettling despite weeks of trying to process it. Apparently, I was his most promising student. Lucky me. Not luck, Ivy countered firmly. You saw him for what he was right away. That's why he focused on you, because you weren't an easy target. Because you challenged his control. There was some comfort in this perspective that Vincent's attention had been drawn not by weakness, but by strength, by an awareness he couldn't easily manipulate. It suggested that whatever he'd seen in me wasn't something to be ashamed of or suppressed, but rather something to be understood and directed purposefully. October brought the first significant development in the investigation. Detective Garrett called to inform us that Vincent's laptop had been recovered from a storage unit, rented under a false name in a neighboring state. The contents were disturbing. Extensive notes on his educational philosophy, detailed profiles of past students at various camps, and a journal documenting his own formative experiences. It appears Vincent himself was the victim of a similar predator in his youth, Detective Garrett explained during her follow-up visit. A camp counselor who singled him out for what he called special lessons in survival and awareness. The journal suggests Vincent came to identify with this mentor, to internalize his methods and expand upon them. He was recreating his own trauma, my mother murmured, the psychologist in her recognizing the pattern. In his mind, he was improving upon it, the detective confirmed, creating a more sophisticated system for identifying and testing what he called naturally vigilant individuals. Your son represented something of a culmination of this work, someone who detected the threat immediately, but remained within reach, allowing Vincent to escalate his lessons more gradually than with previous subjects. The laptop yielded another crucial piece of information, evidence of recent online activity suggesting Vincent had fled to Canada immediately after the boathouse incident. Border authorities were alerted, international warrants issued. For the first time since that rainy night, I felt a tentative hope that Vincent might actually be caught, that the shadow hanging over my life might eventually lift. But even as external circumstances improved, my internal landscape remained altered. I had changed in ways both subtle and profound. I found myself instinctively noting exits in new environments, evaluating strangers with a depth of attention I'd never before possessed, creating mental maps of safe spaces and potential hazards wherever I went. In therapy, which my parents had insisted upon and which I had reluctantly come to value, I learned to channel these new instincts constructively, to distinguish between hypervigilance and healthy awareness. My therapist, Dr. Karim, helped me understand that trauma changes the brain's threat detection systems, heightening sensitivity to potential danger. The goal isn't to eliminate this awareness, she explained during one session. It's to integrate it in a way that enhances rather than diminishes your life, to find balance between caution and paralysis. Slowly, with practice and patience, I began to find that balance. The nightmares became less frequent. I could enter new spaces without immediately scanning for threats. I stopped checking the locks multiple times before bed. Small victories, but meaningful ones. November brought snow earlier than usual, transforming the world outside my window into something pristine and quiet. I was sitting at my desk working on a history assignment when my phone buzzed with a text from Detective Garrett, a request for my parents and me to come to the station at our earliest convenience. No explanation, just the simple request, but my heart immediately accelerated. At the station, Detective Garrett led us to a small conference room rather than her usual desk in the bullpen, a change that signaled the importance of whatever she had to share. "We have news," she began without preamble once we were seated. "Vincent Mercer was arrested yesterday in Vancouver. He was using an assumed name, working as a private wilderness guide for teens." The relief that flooded through me was so intense it was almost painful, a physical sensation of release after months of sustained tension. My mother reached for my hand, squeezing tightly. "Is it definitely him?" my father asked, ever the pragmatist. "You're certain?" "Fingerprints and DNA confirm it," Detective Garrett assured us. "There's no doubt. He's in custody and will be extradited to face charges here." "What kind of charges?" I asked, finding my voice. "What will happen to him?" The detective's expression was carefully neutral. Multiple counts of endangering the welfare of minors, false imprisonment, assault, criminal threatening, identity fraud, and potentially attempted kidnapping. The prosecutor believes we have a strong case. particularly with the evidence from the laptop and your testimony. Will I have to see him again? The question slipped out before I could consider it fully, the fear that had lurked beneath all others. Eventually, yes, if the case goes to trial, Detective Garrett acknowledged. But that's months away, and we'll prepare you thoroughly if it comes to that. For now, Vincent is in custody and will remain there. He's not getting out on bail given the severity of the charges and the flight risk he represents. She slid a photograph across the table, Vincent's mugshot, taken in the hours after his arrest. He looked thinner than I remembered, his hair shorter, but his eyes retained that same unsettling intensity, that same calculating assessment of the camera, and whoever might be viewing the image he projected. I thought seeing this might help make it real for you, Detective Garrett explained. Concrete evidence that he can't hurt you or anyone else now. I stared at the image, feeling a complex mixture of emotions, relief, vindication, lingering fear, and something unexpected, pity. Not for the man Vincent had become, but for the boy he once was. Subjected to his own version of the terror he later inflicted, the cycle of trauma made visible in one damaged life. Thank you, I said finally, pushing the photograph back toward the detective. For finding him. For believing me from the beginning. Believing victims is part of the job, she replied simply. But for what it's worth, your account was always credible. Detailed, consistent, corroborated by physical evidence and witness statements. You did everything right from the moment you first noticed something was off about him. As we left the station, the weight that had pressed on my shoulders since that night in the boathouse felt marginally lighter. Vincent was in custody. The immediate threat had been neutralized. Justice would presumably be served through proper legal channels. But the lasting impact of those days at Pine Ridge, the awareness Vincent had sought to cultivate through fear, remained with me, embedded in my perceptions and responses. I would never again move through the world with the oblivious confidence of someone who hasn't encountered predatory intent. I would always notice too much, sense too keenly, evaluate too thoroughly. In the months that followed, I came to recognize this heightened awareness not as Vincent's successful teaching, but as my own hard-won wisdom, purchased at a cost I would never have willingly paid but valuable nonetheless. Like a vaccine derived from the disease itself, my experience with Vincent had cultivated resistance to future threats, an ability to recognize danger in its earliest, most subtle manifestations. And as winter yielded to spring, I began to reclaim spaces I had avoided, to expand the boundaries of what felt safe, to trust my instincts without being ruled by them. I joined a wilderness survival class, ironic given Vincent's fixation on such skills, but empowering in its controlled environment and legitimate instruction. I reconnected with Theo and other friends from before Pine Ridge, balancing new wariness with old connections. Vincent's trial was scheduled for the following September, a date that loomed in my mind like a final examination, a culmination of everything I had processed and learned. I would face him again, would speak my truth in a courtroom, would close that chapter with the full weight of law and community behind me. But regardless of legal outcomes, I had already reached my own verdict on Vincent's twisted philosophy. Awareness born of terror isn't education, it's trauma. True learning comes from understanding danger without being consumed by it, from recognizing threats without becoming obsessed with them, from maintaining vigilance without surrendering joy. That balance between awareness and paranoia, between caution and paralysis, became my ongoing work, my personal curriculum in the aftermath of Pine Ridge. And unlike Vincent's brutal lessons, it was one I chose for myself, defined on my own terms, directed toward a future where fear informed but did not dominate my perception of the world around me. 1 year after Pine Ridge, I stood at the edge of a different lake, watching sunlight dance across its surface. This wasn't a camp, just a weekend trip with Theo and his family to their lakeside cabin. But the similarities were enough to trigger a cascade of memories. The smell of pine, the lapping of water against the shore, the sense of isolation from the normal rhythms of life. "You okay?" Theo asked, appearing at my side with fishing gear in hand. He'd become attuned to my moments of withdrawal, the brief intervals when present reality receded and Pine Ridge resurfaced. "I'm good," I assured him, meaning it despite the momentary disorientation. just remembering. Theo nodded, understanding without requiring elaboration. The year had changed him too, made him more perceptive, more patient, less inclined to dismiss concerns that didn't align with his own experience. Vincent's shadow had touched him as well, if less directly. "Dad's grilling tonight," he said after a comfortable silence. "Want to help me catch something worth cooking, or should we admit defeat and defrost the backup hamburgers?" The normalcy of the question, the easy humor, pulled me firmly back into the present. "Let's give it an hour," I suggested. "If the fish aren't biting by then, we surrender with dignity." As we settled into familiar positions on the small dock, casting lines into the clear water, I reflected on the distance I'd traveled since that night in the boathouse. Vincent's trial had concluded 2 months earlier, a surprisingly brief affair once his lawyers realized the strength of the evidence against him. He had accepted a plea deal, 15 years with no possibility of parole for 10, plus mandatory psychiatric treatment. I had been prepared to testify, had rehearsed my statement countless times with the prosecutor and victim advocates. But in the end, my in-person testimony wasn't needed. Vincent's own writings, the physical evidence, and the statements from multiple campers across several summers proved sufficient to convince both the court and his own legal team that fighting the charges would only result in a longer sentence. The only time I saw him in person was during the sentencing hearing, where victims were permitted to deliver impact statements. I had debated whether to attend at all, whether seeing Vincent again would undo months of healing and recovery. But ultimately I chose to go, not for closure, which I'd learned was more process than event, but for reclamation, to take back some small measure of power from the man who had tried to reshape me according to his distorted vision. Vincent had looked smaller in the courtroom than in my memory, diminished by the orange jumpsuit, by the circumstances that had stripped away his carefully constructed authority. But his eyes remained the same, moving over the assembled victims and families with that familiar clinical assessment, as if even here, even now, we remained subjects in his ongoing study of human fear responses. My statement was brief but direct. I spoke not of terror or trauma, though both were real and lasting, but of the perversion of teaching that Vincent had embodied. A true teacher, I had said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system, empowers students to grow beyond their limitations, to become more fully themselves. You sought the opposite, to break us down, to remake us in your image, to exploit our natural instincts for your own gratification. You called it education. The court recognizes it as abuse, and I recognize it as the desperate act of someone who can only feel powerful by making others feel powerless. Vincent's expression hadn't changed as I spoke. That same flat effect, that same empty smile. But something had flickered briefly in his eyes when I mentioned power. Recognition, perhaps, or the irritation of being so transparently understood by someone he had viewed merely as a subject, a potential protege. The judge had thanked me for my statement, and I had returned to my seat between my parents, trembling slightly but unbroken. Vincent had watched me the entire way, his gaze heavy with unspoken thoughts. It was the last time I would see him, in person, though not the last time I would confront his influence in my life. "Earth to daydreamer," Theo's voice cut through my reverie. "You've got a bite." I snapped back to the present, feeling the telltale tug on my fishing line. The moment of distraction nearly cost me the catch, but muscle memory took over as I played the fish carefully, eventually landing a respectable base that Theo's father would later declare almost worth the effort of cleaning. That evening, as we sat around a campfire beside the lake, something shifted subtly in my perception. The dancing flames, the darkening woods, the occasional distant sounds of wildlife, elements that might once have triggered hypervigilance and anxiety, instead created a backdrop of natural comfort. I was aware of my surroundings, yes, but not consumed by them, present without being paranoid. Vincent would have called it regression, a return to the complacency he so despised. I recognized it as healing, the integration of awareness without the paralysis of fear. The ability to sit in a setting similar to Pine Ridge and experience not just the echoes of trauma, but the simple pleasure of friendship, family, and natural beauty. The conversation around the fire drifted toward future plans, college applications, potential majors, the impending transitions that would reshape our lives in the coming year. Theo's younger sister was peppering her parents with questions about campus tours, and I found myself genuinely engaged in the discussion, offering suggestions based on my own research. "What about you?" Theo's mother asked me during a lull. "Have you decided on a major yet?" The question was innocent, but it touched on something I had been considering privately for months, uncertain how to articulate it even to those closest to me. "I'm thinking about psychology," I said, watching the flames rather than meeting anyone's eyes. "Maybe with a focus on trauma and resilience." The connection to my own experience hung unspoken in the air, but Theo's mother nodded thoughtfully. "That's a growing field, especially with what we know now about how trauma affects the brain, how people recover from extreme experiences." "Exactly," I agreed, relieved by her matter-of-fact response. "I've been reading a lot about it this year, and it's fascinating how different people process the same types of events, how some develop PTSD while others show what they call post-traumatic growth." "And which category do you fall into?" Theo's father asked gently, the question more perceptive than I might have expected. I considered this, watching sparks rise from the fire into the darkening sky. "Both, I think. At different times." "Different days," I paused, then added, "I'd like to understand it better. Maybe help others navigate it someday." The conversation moved on, but that moment, the quiet articulation of a purpose that had been forming gradually over the past year, felt significant. Vincent had sought to mold me into a reflection of himself, to perpetuate his distorted philosophy through my education. Instead, I was finding my own path, one that acknowledged the impact of trauma but redirected it toward healing rather than harm. Later that night, lying in a sleeping bag on the cabin's screened porch, listening to the gentle rhythm of the lake against the shore, I thought about transformation, how experiences shape us for better or worse. Vincent had been shaped by his own encounters with predatory behavior, had allowed that shaping to turn him into a predator himself. I was being shaped too, but with consciousness, with choice, with community that supported growth rather than exploitation. The therapist I'd been seeing, Dr. Karim, had talked often about narrative, how the stories we tell about our experiences influence our relationship to them. Vincent had tried to impose his narrative on me, to cast me as the protege in his distorted hero's journey. But the true power of story lies in authorship, in the ability to interpret one's own experience rather than accepting another's interpretation. I was writing my own story now, one in which Pine Ridge figured prominently, but did not define the plot. Vincent was a character in that story, but not its author or its central figure, and the ending, still being written, still unfolding, belonged to me alone. Sleep came easily that night without the usual vigilance, without the reflexive checking of locks and shadows. And when I dreamed, it wasn't of boathouses or storms or pale faces watching through windows. Instead, I dreamed of open paths through sunlit forests, of clear water reflecting endless sky, of movement without pursuit. In the morning, I woke to birdsong and dappled light filtering through the porch screens. Theo was already up, making coffee in the kitchen with exaggerated carefulness to avoid waking the others. He grinned when he saw me, gesturing toward the dock where fishing rods leaned against the railing. "Sunrise fishing?" he suggested in a stage whisper. "They're supposedly more active early." 20 minutes later, we sat side by side on the dock's edge, lines in the water, mugs of coffee cooling beside us. The lake was still, its surface a perfect mirror of the sky's gradual transition from pink to blue. Mist hung in patches over the water, dissipating slowly as the sun climbed higher. "It's been a year," Theo observed quietly, breaking a comfortable silence. "Since Pine Ridge." I nodded, appreciating that he'd acknowledged the anniversary without making it the center of our mourning. "A long year." "A good one, though," he suggested, glancing at me. "In some ways, at least." I considered this, weighing the fear and nightmares against the growth, the new awareness, the deepened relationships. Yes, I agreed finally, in some important ways. We lapsed back into silence, watching a heron stalk deliberately through the shallows nearby, its movements precise and patient. There was something meditative about its focus, its complete presence in the moment, neither dwelling on the past nor anticipating the future. I had been learning that skill, presence, over months of practice. The ability to recognize when my mind was sliding into hypervigilance or flashback, to gently redirect my attention to the immediate reality around me, to distinguish between the echo of past danger and the absence of present threat. I had a thought, Theo said after the heron had successfully speared a small fish and departed with its prize. About Vincent. The name still triggered a physical response, a tightening in my chest, a slight acceleration of my heartbeat, but the reaction was milder than it once had been, manageable rather than overwhelming. What about him? I asked, careful to keep my tone neutral. Theo hesitated, uncharacteristically cautious. You said he was fixated on teaching awareness, on making people see dangers they normally miss. He paused, then continued. But what if he was actually teaching the opposite? How to become the kind of person others should be wary of? How to hide in plain sight? How to use authority to bypass normal defenses? The insight struck me as both obvious and profound, a perspective shift that reframed Vincent's entire philosophy. He hadn't been training vigilant protectors. He'd been demonstrating predatory techniques while disguising them as protection. That makes sense, I said slowly. He wasn't creating guardians. He was creating duplicates, people who knew how to exploit the same vulnerabilities he exploited. Exactly, Theo agreed, warming to the topic. It's like he was saying, look how easily I can manipulate systems, gain trust, isolate targets. You could do this too if you learn from me. The realization was simultaneously disturbing and liberating. Disturbing in its implication of Vincent's true intentions. Liberating in how completely it rejected the frame he had tried to impose on his teaching. So when I refused to become his student in that sense, I began. You were actually demonstrating the real awareness he claimed to value, Theo finished. The ability to recognize manipulation for what it is, to resist it rather than internalize it. We fell silent again, contemplating this reframing of the Pine Ridge events. A fish tugged at Theo's line, and he reacted automatically, setting the hook and beginning the careful process of reeling it in. I watched, struck by the normality of the moment, the simple pleasure of sitting with a friend in early morning sunlight, discussing difficult truths while engaged in an activity as ancient and straightforward as fishing. This, I realized, was reclamation in its purest form. Not the absence of memory or the denial of impact, but the integration of experience into a life that remained fundamentally my own, neither defined by trauma nor ignorant of its lessons. Vincent would spend the next decade or more in prison, his movements restricted, his access to potential students severed. But even if he eventually re-entered society, he would find a changed landscape. Camps with stricter hiring protocols, counselors subject to closer supervision, campers and parents more willing to report concerning behavior. His legacy, ironically, was the opposite of what he had intended. Instead of creating disciples who would carry forward his methodology, he had inadvertently strengthened the systems designed to prevent such exploitation. The awareness he claimed to value had indeed spread, not as hypervigilance or paranoia, but as institutional safeguards and educated caution. As Theo landed his fish, another base, smaller than yesterday's but still respectable, I felt a sense of completion, of a circle closing. Not an ending exactly, but a milestone in an ongoing journey of recovery and growth. The Vincent chapter wasn't erased from my story, but it was no longer the chapter I was actively writing. Nice catch, I said, helping Theo unhook the fish before he released it back into the lake. Your dad will be impressed. Nah, this one's too small for breakfast, Theo replied, watching the base dart away into deeper water. Better to let it grow bigger for next time. Next time. The simple phrase contained multitudes, the assumption of future visits, of continued friendship, of experiences that would build upon rather than merely repeat the past. The promise of growth and change, of moving forward without forgetting where I'd been. The sun had fully cleared the tree line now, burning away the last wisps of morning mist from the lake's surface. Beyond the dock, the day was taking shape. Theo's family stirring in the cabin, breakfast preparations beginning, plans forming for hiking or swimming or simply relaxing in the summer warmth. I cast my line again, watching it arc through the golden light before disappearing beneath the water's surface. Whatever lay beneath, whether fish or simply the peaceful absence of activity, I was present for it, attentive without anxiety, aware without fear. And in that moment of perfect balance between past and future, between memory and anticipation, I recognized the most significant lesson of the year since Pine Ridge, that trauma may change the landscape of a life, may alter its contours and redirect its rivers, but it need not determine its ultimate destination. Vincent had sought to define me through fear. Instead, I was defining myself through resilience, through the slow, steady work of reclaiming spaces, relationships, and possibilities that fear had temporarily placed beyond reach. Not as his student, but as my own teacher. Not as a reflection of his distorted vision, but as the author of a story still unfolding, one chapter at a time, toward a horizon limited only by my own imagination and courage. The water rippled beneath my floating line, a fish investigating the potential meal. I waited, patient and present, ready for whatever might come next. I've never told anyone the complete story of what happened that spring break when I was 14. 3 years have passed since that day, but the memories remain vivid, too vivid, keeping me awake on stormy nights when the branches scrape against my bedroom window. The rational part of my mind understands that what we experienced that afternoon behind the restaurant was likely nothing more than an abandoned playground, coupled with our overactive imaginations. Yet the irrational part, the primitive brainstem that controls our fight-or-flight response, refuses to accept such a simple explanation. It was April 2022 when my parents decided I should spend time with family during spring break instead of wasting away in front of screens at home. They arranged for me to stay at my uncle's cabin in the North Woods with my 11-year-old cousin Ivy. I wasn't thrilled about the arrangement initially. Being 14 meant I'd rather spend time with friends than babysit a younger cousin, but my protests fell on deaf ears. The cabin itself was nothing remarkable, a 2-bedroom wooden structure nestled among towering pine trees about 30 miles from the nearest town. My Uncle William had inherited it from his father, and visited occasionally for hunting and fishing trips. The walls were adorned with mounted fish and photographs of successful hunting expeditions. A musty odor of mothballs and old wood permeated every room. Uncle William's wife, my Aunt Patricia, would be supervising us during our stay. She was a practical woman who preferred outdoor activities to indoor comforts, which explained why the cabin's amenities were limited to the basics: running water, electricity, and a wood-burning stove for heating. No internet connection, spotty cell service at best. On our 3rd day at the cabin, after a morning spent hiking through the surrounding woods, Aunt Patricia suggested we drive into town for lunch at Riverbank Diner, a local establishment she claimed served the best country fried steak in the county. The prospect of a proper meal excited both Ivy and me after days of Aunt Patricia's questionable cooking skills. The drive took almost 40 minutes along winding roads bordered by dense forest. I spent the journey watching the endless sea of trees while Ivy chattered away about a frog she'd found that morning, by the small creek running behind the cabin. "Do you think we'll see any bears?" Ivy asked, her voice tinged with both fear and hope. "Not likely," I replied. "They usually avoid people." "What about wolves? Uncle William said there are wolves around here." I shrugged. "Maybe, but they're more afraid of us than we are of them." Riverbank Diner stood at the edge of the small town, a weathered structure with faded red paint and a sign that had seen better days. The parking lot contained only a handful of vehicles, mostly pickup trucks and SUVs with mud-splattered tires. A bell jingled as we entered, announcing our arrival to the sparse crowd of locals enjoying their midday meals. The interior smelled of grease, coffee, and pine-scented cleaning solution. Wood paneling covered the walls, interrupted occasionally by framed black and white photographs of the town from decades past. A counter with red vinyl stools ran along one wall, while booths with cracked leather seats occupied the opposite side. A waitress in her 50s with bottle blonde hair piled high on her head approached us with a tired smile. Her name tag read, Betty. "Welcome to Riverbank," she said, leading us to a booth near the back. "Don't get many visitors this time of year." Aunt Patricia exchanged pleasantries with Betty, revealing they had attended the same high school years earlier. They fell into conversation about people I didn't know, leaving Ivy and me to examine our laminated menus. "I want a milkshake," Ivy whispered, her eyes wide with anticipation. "Ask Aunt Patricia," I suggested, scanning the lunch options. The meal itself was unremarkable, standard diner fare that satisfied our hunger without inspiring culinary praise. Ivy spilled her chocolate milkshake on her shirt, causing Aunt Patricia to sigh in exasperation and dab at the stain with napkins. As we finished our meal, Betty returned to clear our plates. "Got kids with you today, huh, Patricia?" she said, nodding toward us. "My niece and nephew," Aunt Patricia confirmed, "trying to keep them entertained for the week." Betty leaned down conspiratorially. "There's a playground out back if they want to burn off some energy. My grandkids love it when they visit." Ivy immediately perked up. "A playground? Can we go, please?" Aunt Patricia checked her watch. "I suppose so. I need to run to the hardware store for some supplies anyway. You two can play outside while I do that." "There's an entrance through the back door," Betty offered, pointing to a door near the restrooms. "Just follow the path." As we got up to leave, I noticed Betty's smile falter slightly, but I dismissed it as my imagination. Now looking back, I wonder if she knew, if she had sent other children down that path before us. We exited through the back door of the diner into an enclosed area containing dumpsters and stacks of empty wooden pallets. The smell of rotting food and cigarette smoke hung in the air. A narrow dirt path led from a gap in the wooden fence into the woods behind the restaurant. "Do you think it's far?" Ivy asked, already starting down the path. "Betty made it sound close," I replied, following her. "It's probably just through these trees." The path wound its way through underbrush and between pine trees. Though it was early afternoon, the dense canopy above cast everything in shadow. The sounds of the diner, clinking dishes, conversations, occasional bursts of laughter, faded with each step until all we could hear was the crunch of pine needles beneath our feet and the distant calls of birds. "This is taking forever," Ivy complained after several minutes of walking. I had to agree. The path seemed to stretch on much longer than expected for a playground supposedly behind a restaurant. I was about to suggest turning back when the trees ahead thinned, revealing a small clearing. "Look," Ivy pointed excitedly. "I see something." The clearing opened before us, approximately 30 yards in diameter, surrounded on all sides by towering pine trees that seemed to lean inward, as if watching us. The ground was mostly dirt with patches of yellowed grass struggling to grow in the perpetual shade. At first glance, the area appeared to be an abandoned lot rather than a playground. Debris littered the ground, broken bottles, cigarette butts, faded food wrappers. But as my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I saw what had caught Ivy's attention: the outline of playground equipment on the far side of the clearing. Something about the scene felt wrong. The playground equipment appeared disproportionate, misaligned somehow, as if designed by someone who had only heard descriptions of what a playground should look like without ever having seen one. "Come on," Ivy called, already halfway across the clearing. I hesitated, scanning our surroundings. The air felt heavier here, stagnant. No breeze disturbed the branches above us. No birds called. Even the insects seemed to have fallen silent. "Wait up," I said, hurrying after her while trying to dismiss my growing unease. I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was just an old playground, nothing more. Why then did each step toward it fill me with increasing dread? Before we reached the playground equipment, we encountered an old couch sitting incongruously beneath a tall pine tree. The furniture piece was filthy, its fabric torn in multiple places with stuffing spilling out like yellow intestines. Dark stains spread across its cushions in patterns that resembled crude faces if you looked at them too long. Who would put a couch out here? I wondered aloud. Ivy shrugged, already looking beyond it to the playground equipment. Maybe teenagers use it to hang out? The thought of people voluntarily spending time in this gloomy clearing disturbed me. I stepped around the couch, noticing empty beer cans and cigarette butts concentrated around it, supporting Ivy's theory. Beyond the couch stood what I presumed to be the playground Betty had mentioned. A rusted swing set with 2 remaining swings, the third chain dangling empty, stood beside a metal slide with peeling green paint. The slide's ladder was missing several rungs, and what appeared to be initials and crude symbols had been scratched into its surface. Ivy approached the swings, testing one cautiously before sitting down. "Be careful," I warned. "That thing looks ancient." "It's fine," she replied, pushing off with her feet to start swinging. The structure creaked ominously with each forward movement, but held together. I remained standing, suddenly reluctant to touch anything in this place. While Ivy swung, I surveyed our surroundings more carefully. The clearing wasn't as natural as it had first appeared. The ground showed evidence of having been leveled at some point, though nature had begun to reclaim it. Weeds pushed through cracks in what might once have been a concrete pad. At the edges of the clearing, garbage had accumulated, rusted appliances, tires, broken furniture. Then I noticed something that made my stomach contract. On the opposite side of the clearing stood what resembled a jungle gym, but distorted in a way that defied logical explanation. The metal bars formed angles that seemed to change when viewed from different positions. A large black electrical cord wrapped around the topmost bar, hanging down several feet. Attached to it was a yellow extension cord with a light fixture dangling at its end. Most disturbing of all was what hung from another section of the structure. A baby doll suspended by a strip of black cloth around its neck. The doll's plastic face had been partially melted, its painted features dripping down in a parody of tears. Its limbs were positioned at impossible angles, and someone had drawn crude symbols across its torso with what looked like red marker, or something worse. That was when the feeling of dread that had been building since we entered the clearing intensified tenfold, transforming into raw, primal fear. We weren't alone. "Ivy," I called, my voice emerging as little more than a whisper. "Ivy, we should go." She continued swinging, oblivious to my growing panic. "We just got here. Aunt Patricia won't be done shopping for at least half an hour." I stepped closer to the swing set, my eyes repeatedly drawn back to the hanging doll. From this new angle, I could see that someone had removed its eyes, leaving empty sockets that seemed to follow my movements. "This place isn't right," I insisted. "Look around you." Ivy slowed her swinging, finally noticing the disturbed expression on my face. She followed my gaze to the distorted jungle gym and the suspended doll. "That's creepy," she admitted, her previous enthusiasm dimming. "Who would do that to a doll?" "I don't know, but I don't want to stick around to find out." I gestured toward the path. "Let's go back to the diner." Ivy reluctantly slid off the swing but paused before following me. "What's that?" she asked, pointing to a structure I hadn't noticed before. Partially hidden behind a cluster of bushes at the edge of the clearing stood what appeared to be a wooden doghouse. Except this doghouse was much too large enough for a human to crawl inside comfortably. Its roof was covered with tar paper, and its entrance was a dark rectangle revealing nothing of its interior. Someone had painted a word above the entrance, but weather and time had made it illegible, with only the letters STAY remaining visible. "It's nothing," I said firmly, grabbing Ivy's hand. "Just a shed or something." Ivy pulled away from me, her curiosity overriding her better judgment. "It looks like a giant doghouse." Before I could stop her, she had crossed the clearing toward the structure. I followed reluctantly, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped animal seeking escape. As we approached, details emerged that heightened my anxiety. A chain was bolted to one side of the structure, ending in what looked disturbingly like a collar sized for a human neck. Scratches marked the wood around the entrance, some appearing to have been made from the inside. Ivy leaned forward, peering into the dark opening. I grabbed her shoulder to pull her back, but she had already seen something that made her gasp. "I think there's someone in there," she whispered, her voice trembling. I forced myself to look. The interior was shrouded in darkness, but I could make out what seemed to be a pile of blankets or rags in one corner, and something else. Something that reflected the dim light filtering through the entrance. A pair of eyes. I jerked backward, pulling Ivy with me so forcefully that she stumbled. "There's someone in the doghouse," she repeated, her voice rising in panic. Whether it was truly a person or merely an animal seeking shelter, I didn't care to discover. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to escape this clearing and never return. As if responding to our discovery, a sound broke the unnatural silence of the clearing, a high-pitched whirring noise coming from somewhere above us. I looked up, scanning the treetops and the sky beyond, but saw nothing that could explain the sound. "We need to go," I said, no longer bothering to hide my fear. "Now." We turned and ran toward the path, no longer concerned with appearing brave or mature. The sound above us intensified, its pitch fluctuating in a way that reminded me of a circular saw cutting through different densities of wood. It seemed to follow us, moving from one treetop to another as we fled. Just as we reached the entrance to the path, my right leg seized with an excruciating cramp. The muscle in my calf contracted violently, sending me stumbling to one knee with a cry of pain. "What's wrong?" Ivy asked, stopping a few feet ahead on the path. "Cramp," I gasped, massaging my calf desperately. "Keep going, I'll catch up." Ivy hesitated, torn between continuing to safety and staying with me. "Go," I insisted. The whirring sound was directly above us now, and looking up, I caught a glimpse of movement among the pine branches, something dark shifting position, tracking our movements. Ivy finally obeyed. Running down the path while repeatedly glancing back at me, I forced myself to stand despite the pain, putting weight on my good leg while dragging the cramped one behind me. Each step sent jolts of agony up my leg, but fear provided a powerful anesthetic. I limped after Ivy as quickly as my injured leg would allow, constantly aware of the sound following us through the trees. The path that had seemed so long on our way to the playground now felt endless. Branches clawed at my clothing and face as I stumbled forward, certain that at any moment I would feel hands grabbing me from behind. When the back of the diner finally appeared through the trees, I nearly collapsed with relief. Ivy stood at the edge of the restaurant's property, waiting for me with wide, frightened eyes. "Did you see it?" she asked as I limped the final few yards to join her. "See what?" When I looked back, she swallowed hard. There was a person following us on the path, walking real slow but following. I turned to look back at the path we had emerged from. The entrance stood empty, framed by undergrowth and pine trees swaying gently in a breeze I couldn't feel. Nothing moved among the shadows, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. "Let's get inside," I suggested, my voice steadier than I felt. We hurried through the back entrance of the diner, the normalcy of the kitchen sounds and fluorescent lighting, providing an immediate but superficial comfort. A cook glanced at us with mild curiosity as we passed through but said nothing. In the main dining area, the lunch crowd had thinned considerably. Betty was wiping down a table near the entrance, and she smiled as we approached. "Did you kids enjoy the playground?" she asked cheerfully. I exchanged a look with Ivy, unsure how to respond. How could Betty refer to that disturbing place as if it were a normal children's playground? "It was interesting," I managed to say. Betty's smile faltered slightly. "It's seen better days, I suppose. The town used to maintain it properly, but budget cuts, you know how it is." Her casual explanation stunned me into silence. Had we somehow misinterpreted everything we'd seen? Was the hanging doll just discarded trash? The doghouse some abandoned storage shed? The eyes merely a reflection or a small animal? Before I could formulate more questions, Aunt Patricia entered the diner carrying bags from the hardware store. "There you are," she said. "Ready to head back to the cabin?" On the drive back to the cabin, Ivy and I sat in silence while Aunt Patricia talked about the supplies she'd purchased and her plans for fixing the cabin's leaking roof. Neither of us mentioned what we'd experienced behind the restaurant. I wasn't sure if it was because we feared not being believed or because speaking about it would somehow make it more real. My leg continued to throb, the muscle still tight from the cramp. I massaged it absently while staring out the window at the passing forest, seeing hanging dolls and oversized doghouses in every shadow between the trees. When we arrived at the cabin, Aunt Patricia instructed us to wash up before dinner. In the bathroom, I splashed cold water on my face and stared at my reflection in the spotted mirror. My complexion appeared paler than usual, with dark circles forming beneath my eyes despite having slept well the previous night. During dinner, Ivy pushed her food around her plate without eating much, uncharacteristically quiet. Aunt Patricia noticed, pressing the back of her hand to Ivy's forehead to check for fever. "Are you feeling all right?" she asked. Ivy nodded unconvincingly. "Just tired from playing." "You didn't overexert yourself at that playground, did you?" Aunt Patricia frowned. "Betty mentioned it was old. I probably should have checked it out myself before letting you two go off alone." The opportunity to tell her what we'd seen presented itself. But when I opened my mouth, different words emerged. It was fine. Just old swings and a slide. Why had I lied? Part of me worried that Aunt Patricia would dismiss our experience as childish imagination. Another part feared she would believe us and investigate, potentially encountering whatever had followed us on the path. After dinner, Ivy and I sat on the cabin's small porch, watching darkness settle over the forest. The usual evening sounds, owls hooting, insects chirping, the occasional rustling of nocturnal animals, seemed threatening now in a way they hadn't before. "We should tell someone," Ivy said suddenly, breaking our prolonged silence. "Tell them what? That we found a creepy playground? That doesn't exactly warrant calling the police." "What about the doghouse? Someone was in there, I know it." I sighed, rubbing my still sore calf. Maybe it was a homeless person using it for shelter. Or maybe it was just an animal. "You saw the eyes," Ivy insisted. "Those weren't animal eyes." "We don't know that for sure." Ivy turned to face me directly. "Why are you pretending it wasn't weird?" "You were scared too, I saw your face." She was right. I was attempting to rationalize what we'd experienced, to file it away as something explainable and therefore less frightening. But deep down I knew better. "What about the sound?" I asked quietly. "The whirring noise that followed us? Could have been machinery somewhere. Or a drone. In the middle of the woods?" We fell silent again, each lost in our own thoughts. Eventually, Aunt Patricia called us inside as night had fully descended. She had prepared the couch for me to sleep on while Ivy would take the small guest bedroom. Sleep did not come easily that night. Every creak of the cabin's wooden structure, every whisper of wind through the pine needles outside jolted me back to alertness. When I finally did drift off, my dreams were filled with distorted playground equipment and dark openings where eyes gleamed from shadows. I'm 17 now, and I haven't returned to that town or my uncle's cabin since that spring break. My parents divorced the following year, and summer vacations have been spent shuttling between their separate homes in the city. Ivy and I don't talk about what happened, though occasionally I catch her watching me with a questioning look during family gatherings, as if wondering if I still remember. I remember. Every detail remains preserved in my memory with disturbing clarity. Last month, curiosity and the passage of time emboldened me to search online for information about the town, and specifically the Riverbank Diner. What I found disturbed me more than I anticipated. The diner had closed permanently 6 months after our visit. Local news articles cited health code violations without specifying details. More disturbing were the comment sections beneath these articles where locals hinted at darker reasons for the closure. One commenter wrote, "That place was always wrong. Remember the Hanson boy in '98? Another replied, "They never should have built on that land. Some places aren't meant for people." The most unsettling discovery came from a blog dedicated to local history. A post from 2015 included a black and white photograph from the 1940s showing the clearing where we had found the playground. No playground equipment existed then, but in its place stood a large house. The caption read, "Woodman Estate before the fire of 1952. 7 children perished when the orphanage burned." Local rumors claimed the director had been performing experiments on his charges. I've tried contacting the blog's author for more information, but my emails have gone unanswered. Public records from that era are sparse, and what little I've found makes no mention of experiments or unusual circumstances surrounding the fire. Sometimes I wonder if Ivy saw the same things I did that day. Children's memories are malleable, susceptible to suggestion and revision over time. Perhaps what I recall as terrifying was merely an abandoned playground with ordinary debris that my 14-year-old mind transformed into something sinister. Yet this rationalization fails to explain certain details. The whirring sound that followed us, the eyes in the doghouse, the feeling of being watched. These elements resist logical explanation. Last week, I received a text message from an unknown number. It contained only 5 words. "Do you remember the playground?" I didn't respond. I blocked the number immediately. telling myself it was merely a wrong number or random spam. My hands trembled for hours afterward. Tonight, as I write this account, a familiar sound has been drifting through my bedroom window. A high-pitched whirring that rises and falls in pitch like a circular saw cutting through different densities of wood. It's been 3 years since I heard that sound, but I recognized it instantly. I've closed the blinds and locked the window. I've told myself it's just construction somewhere in the neighborhood, though it's nearly midnight and no lights are visible outside. Part of me wants to dismiss everything that happened as the overactive imagination of a 14-year-old. But another part knows better. Some places in this world exist at the intersection of what's real and what shouldn't be. The playground behind Riverbank Diner was such a place, a location where something terrible had occurred and left an imprint that time couldn't erase. I don't know what watched us from the doghouse that day, or what followed us along the path. I don't want to know. Some questions are better left unanswered. But sometimes, in my darkest moments, I wonder if it knows where to find me. If you're reading this and come across a small diner at the edge of a forest with a playground behind it, my advice is simple. Keep driving. Some playgrounds aren't meant for children, or for anyone else.